welcome to the September edition of our seminar series. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm kind of hosting this seminar, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to extend that respect to the lands that you may be joining us from and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. Thank you. So as I say, welcome to our seminar series. A bit of an odd time today. So typically we hold these on a Thursday at 4 p.m, but we have a special speaker today, an international speaker, our second international speaker of the year. And in order to accommodate the kind of time difference between Victoria and Canada, we have chosen this new time. So thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so today we'll be having, I'll be introducing our speaker in a moment, but we'll be talking about challenges in studying the relationship between incarceration and reoffending in British Columbia, Canada. And from my memory, it's primarily focused on young people, this study. Okay, and so there should be a lot of interest, particularly here in Victoria. There's a lot of discussion kind of taking place in that particular space. Before I introduce our speaker, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't signed up to our mailing list, you can see the email kind of in front of you. Send an email across to that address. Indicate that you'd like to join the mailing list and you'll never miss out on a seminar again. Tell your friends, tell your family, get them to join. They'll never miss out either. Lots of fun. Okay. Now, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Evan McCuish. I hope I pronounced that properly. Have I?
McCuish, but like honestly,
McCuish.
I don't even know how to say it, so it's okay.
That's good. That makes two of us. Okay, great. Well, this is Associate Professor Evan McCuish, who's joining us today from Simon Fraser University, where he's an associate professor and the principal investigator of the Incarcerated Serious and Violent Offender Young Study, which has been ongoing. It's a longitudinal study that's been ongoing since 1998. He is the recipient of several awards, including the American Psychology Law Society Outstanding Dissertation Award, and the American Society of Criminology Division of Developmental and Life Course Criminology Early Career Researcher Award. His research interests obviously involve developmental criminology, which will be kind of largely the topic today, desistance, and psychopathy. He's published in a range of kind of high-profile journals, leading journals in the areas of criminology and forensic psychology. His latest book, The Life Course of Serious and Violent Youth Grown Up, a 20-year longitudinal study, is now available from Routledge. Go get yourselves a copy. He's currently completing a book on psychopathy to be published by Cambridge University Press, which we're all looking forward to. Okay, so before I throw to Evan, just a little bit more housekeeping. There is the opportunity to ask questions following the presentation. Just enter your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A in the Q&A box, which you'll see up above, like in your various kind of your toolbar. Okay, so either way, and we'll get to your questions following the presentations, but feel free to enter them at any point so you don't forget. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to stop sharing. Evan, thank you very much, and I'll allow you to start sharing your presentation and get going.
Great, thanks. So I'll just do that now, and thanks everyone for being here, and especially sort of joining all of us on the time that's not really the normal schedule for all of you. I appreciate everything. I'm really thankful that Ben invited me to be here, especially just because I think this is a relatively complex topic, and it's nice to be able to talk about this and have more of a discussion. Is everybody able to hear me? Could I get some thumbs up or something on video? Because I saw a few messages saying that maybe you couldn't hear me. Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Excellent. So the first slide that you see here is a Vincent van Gogh painting based on an original drawing that kind of is meant to depict the monotony and the hopelessness of prison in the 19th century. And especially if we look at sort of media portrayals of the incarceration experience, it might be easy to conclude that well, basically, not much has changed. Incarceration is punitive, it restricts freedom, and seems to have a lot of negative consequences for life course roles and outcomes. So, not just reoffending, but in terms of disrupting family connectivity, disrupting employment, and disrupting access to housing. So there are arguments in favor of incarceration that basically say that, well, yes, it might disrupt family connectivity and employment and access to housing, but all of this can be justified. And it can be justified basically because incarceration will reduce reoffending. Now, but in 2021, Damon Petrick and colleagues did a meta-analysis of 116 different studies that have looked at the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. And their conclusion was basically that there's a universal consensus that custodial sanctions do not reduce reoffending. And so basically the justification for being disruptive to employment and housing and family connectivity seems to not actually be applicable. It seems that the incarceration is expensive, it's punitive, it's socially harmful, and then it also actually achieves its intended purpose of reducing reoffending. But one of the things, so when I was reading this study, I was kind of looking at all of the papers that were in the meta-analysis. Patrick Lussier and I have done a series of meta-analyses on recidivism rates among people who've committed sex offenses. And one of the things that we were attuned to in these meta-analyses was paying attention to the jurisdiction in which research was being conducted. And I think it was something like 85% of the studies that were included in that 2021 meta-analysis focused on data from the United States. Um, and I think that the United States has quite a different custody context compared to Canada. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in Australia, but just based on what I've looked at in terms of youth incarceration rates in Australia, they seem much closer to Canadian youth incarceration rates than United States youth incarceration rates. So I certainly suggest that Canada shares more in common with Australia than it does with the United States in terms of how we approach the youth justice system. So not only are these studies mainly focused on the United States, but they also fail to do two things in my mind. One is they fail to use statistical analyses that align with theory. So when we talk about why incarceration would reduce reoffending, we're very much focused on a developmental lens where we think about things from a within individual perspective. For example, from a labeling perspective, we might anticipate that if you increase an individual sanction, then you would see a increase in their reoffending because they would experience that sort of master or primary status as deviant. Similarly, in Canada, for example, we have recidivism sentencing premiums. So the idea is that we need to punish people more harshly than they were punished in the past, and that within individual change in punishment would have a subsequent within individual reduction in reoffending. But all of the studies basically in the 2021 meta-analysis were all looking at between group differences, not focused on individual change, but rather, for example, do people on probation have a higher or lower level of offending compared to people who experienced a custody sanction? What's also limited about these studies is the challenge of addressing selection bias, which is what I'll get into in a little bit. And no, this is just a classic me. I like to take a lot of time with my first slide just to sort of caption everything before we get into things. But I do promise we now are heading into the second slide. So again, what I'm really happy about is getting the opportunity to kind of clarify some of the findings from this paper that we published. I don't even remember when it was, end of 2024, beginning of 2025. But sort of 4 key points that I want to touch on. One is just how actually methodologically complex it is to study the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. So much so that in a 2009 meta-analysis, Dan Nagan and colleagues even recommended, well, maybe we should actually just stop trying to study the relationship between incarceration and reoffending, at least from a quantitative perspective, because we're failing to deal with some of these methodological complexities in a reliable way. If we can't do things reliably, then maybe we shouldn't be doing them at all. That's another thing that I want to sort of caption today, is that I'm only talking about quantitative methodological approaches, and not because I think that they're the only ones that are important, but they're the ones that I feel more comfortable actually having an opinion on. The other thing that I want to kind of touch on is that we need research across multiple jurisdictions, because the United States captures a very distinct context in terms of who actually ends up in the prison system. And when you know, from a risk need responsivity model perspective, if you are having a high intensity intervention applied to somebody who is lower risk and might do more harm than good. So perhaps that's seeing sort of what we might be seeing in the United States. The other point is that I want to kind of just explain that in our paper, we found that within individual increases in incarceration were associated with within individual decreases in reconvictions. So in fact, incarceration reduced reoffending, but I want to take some time to explain why this might be the case and why I think it would be a mistake to use such findings as a justification for increasing the use of incarceration or no longer considering alternatives to custody as sentencing options. So we'll begin now with a little bit of a discussion of methodological challenges in approaching research on incarceration and reoffending. And so there are two, or let's say 3 main methodological challenges. One is making sure that our theories are appropriately tested. So how we describe the impact of incarceration on offending in theory can tend to be a little bit different from how we actually statistically analyze the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. I'll talk about 3 generations of research strategies, but first and second generation research strategies especially focused on finding samples of people who are on probation and finding samples of people who received a custody sentence, trying to match those people in different ways, whether it's just through statistical controls or through things like propensity score matching. But ultimately, we don't get to study whether or not people change, which I think is the main focus of incarceration. Is, you know, not saying whether it works or not, but the idea behind placing somebody in custody is that there's a proposed change that would take place. If we want to study this change, we need to study it from a within individual perspective. And so one of the key contributions of our paper that we think is sort of introducing some within individual methods for studying the impact of incarceration on reoffending. Dan Nagan, who has written a lot about the relationship between incarceration and reoffending, mentioned that basically the biggest threat to the reliability of research on incarceration and reoffending is the problem of selection bias. So the idea is that there are pre-incarceration risk and protective factors, prior offending, antisocial propensity, substance use, gang involvement, that are going to be a common cause of both the likelihood of receiving a custody sentence versus, say, a community-based sentence, and also the likelihood of reoffending. So studies that might be observing a criminogenic impact of incarceration, that is to say, studies that find that incarceration increased reoffending, might be doing so because they fail to adequately account for propensity to offend. The fact that a person who is gang involved is probably more likely to receive a custody sentence than somebody who's not gang involved. And then also somebody who's gang involved might be more likely to recidivate compared to somebody who is not gang involved. And so the challenge is that existing methods to account for selection bias are very often flawed in a lot of ways. and within individual analyses can actually address some of these flaws, and I'll explain why in a moment. But one of the other sort of methodological issues that's very often taken for granted is how we account for the process of aging. So we know quite clearly that there's a relationship between aging and offending. Although we've seen, especially some work coming out of Australia, that the age crime curve might be flattening a little bit, we do see a tendency for crime rates to peak in late adolescence and then decline quite swiftly thereafter. So that becomes a methodological problem if we say are trying to create a match sample of people who are on probation and people who received a custody sentence. And so during the follow-up period, let's say we've somehow magically managed to account for the hundreds of factors that might differentiate people who would receive a probation sentence versus people who would receive a custody sentence. So the problem becomes that the person on probation or a community sentence is released into the community earlier, or is even not bound by probation conditions earlier, and then has more of a reoffense opportunity. So they might, in fact, be more inclined to reoffend earlier, not because of a higher likelihood of offending or because probation was a more criminogenic sanction than incarceration, but because they were released at an earlier age, and therefore the follow-up period began at a time when they were more at risk or more prone to offending. So we have like a bunch of methodological challenges that we don't want to assume just cancel each other out. Some might tend to find that prison is more criminogenic. Others that might tend to find that probation has a more criminogenic impact on somebody's reoffending likelihood. And really, for me, it comes down to what I learned in grad school, reading Shadish, Cook, Campbell, going back to research design. And it's the idea that we shouldn't try to fix with statistical analysis what we bungled with research design. So let's get the research design right and not rely just on sort of fancy matching or statistical analyses. So there have been three kind of generations of research on incarceration and reoffending. First generation methods used statistical analyses like logistic regression to look at whether the likelihood of recidivism significantly differed between those sentenced to probation versus those sentenced to incarceration, while accounting for different risk, protective, and demographic factors. Nagin and colleagues, or Nagin and Loeffler in 2022, did another review of the literature on incarceration and reoffending, and basically said that these types of first generation methods are unable to adequately address selection bias. And in fact, we're not even going to review these studies because we don't deem them reliable. Second generation studies used more sophisticated methods to match groups. So trying to figure out how do we get a group of people on probation and a group of people who've been sentenced to custody and match them on all sort of feasible risk and protective factors. But what Loeffler and colleagues in 2009 and 2015 found was that it's very difficult to account for all such factors that differentiate people on probation versus in custody. And also, it only matches the people who can be matched. And atypical cases get excluded. That could include the people who are highest risk. And so we have some concerns about generalizability there. What we've seen in terms of an improvement are these third generation research methods, including regression discontinuity designs and instrumental variable measures or instrumental variable studies. So regression discontinuity designs basically would look at sentencing grid calculations. These are especially popular in the United States. So judges in Canada, judges are much more focused on case law. In the United States, varies by state, but we'll see these sentencing grid calculations. So the judge will have information about a person's index offense or current offense, their past offending history, and so on. And these sentencing grids will give them a recommended sentence. And so these regression discontinuity studies take people who were just barely above the threshold to reach a custody sentence and just barely below the threshold to reach a custody sentence. And the idea would be that these people are effectively the same, and then they could study whether or not reoffending outcomes differed across these two groups. And it's a similar approach to instrumental variables studies, but they usually use random assignment to judges as the study instrument. And I can get into some of the technicalities later in the discussion portion of this talk. But basically, my concern with these sorts of studies is that they restrict samples to those people who are on the margins of receiving a custody sentence. So if a regression discontinuity design is only including the people who just barely met the threshold for a custody sentence, then what about the people who are the highest risk? And does that mean that all of our regression discontinuity studies are excluding the people who are most likely to receive a custody sentence and thus maybe be the most likely to be impacted by a custody sentence? So basically, I've already mentioned this, but trying to figure out would we develop a research design to capture or address selection bias, address the process of aging, and study perspectives or study offending and incarceration from a within individual perspective. And so our goal was to pair the analytic strategy to our research question using a fixed effect model. So for those who aren't familiar, basically what a fixed effect model assumes is that the effect of incarceration is fixed across the population. The idea being that across different subgroups of the population, maybe we would consider subgroups to be people of different genders, different ethnicities, different ages, that incarceration would reduce or increase the likelihood of offending equally across the population. And that's an assumption that maybe is not correct, and is one that sort of needs to be addressed when we try to address it in the paper. But the idea is, if we're all familiar with research a little bit, imagine you have a dichotomous variable in your data set indicating ethnicity where 0 equals non-white and 1 equals white. But if you're to study somebody over time, and you're to study change, so we're studying whether somebody's convictions change between ages 15 and 16, we might subtract 6 convictions at age 16 from 5 convictions at age 15. But if we were to subtract their ethnicity, it'd always be 1 minus 1, for 1 equaling white. And so we're able to effectively, what a fixed effect model is able to do is handle all time invariant confounders. So any static risk factor you could imagine, it will not actually need to even be controlled for in a fixed effect model because we're looking at within individual change. Paul Allison, 2009, it sort of provides a good sort of primer for those who are sort of unfamiliar with fixed effect models. But effectively, each individual acts as their own control. So there's no need for creating any sort of unrealistic counterfactuals. So the formula that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is looking at convictions between 2 time periods. So we're looking at an individual's convictions, so individual I at time t, subtracted by, for that same individual, their number of convictions at the previous year. So basically, again, just looking simply at change. For example, did the individual's level of convictions change between ages 15 and ages 16? And then we can look at changes in incarceration in the previous periods. And so this is what we call a first difference model. And I was kind of, to try and help explain this, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this movie, but it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's called Arrival by Denis Villeneuve, is the director. It's also based on a short story. But traditionally, fixed effects models use what's called person mean centering. And so we would subtract an individual's value at age 15 from, for example, their average number of convictions at each year of age across an entire time period. But the problem there, I know we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's really important just to sort of understand why this matters. if we're subtracting an average that includes things that happened in the future, it doesn't really make sense for the individual. So if you're 17 years old and your average includes periods that existed at age 18 and age 19 and so on, then it's not really reflecting reality. You're not aware of future events, which is something that the movie Arrival was trying to point out. Is for humans, we don't sort of see the full picture. We only know what has happened in our past. And so what we use is called a first difference model. This just basically compares 2 years. So age 15 to age 16 is one example, but you can look at this for a period of 20 years, 30 years, with each sort of time frame comparing from year over year. So to kind of reiterate why we feel that within individual methods are valuable. So one being that between group methods are kind of atheoretical or discordant with existing theoretical perspectives and policies, whereas within individual methods allow us to test theories like labeling effects or policies like sentencing premiums. Between group methods, aside from Gen 3, have struggled to account for selection bias, whereas if you use a within individual method, you're able to account for all time invariant factors. And then for the population, within individual methods, you can study this among anyone, but you do have to have longitudinal data. And for between group methods, especially when you're using regression discontinuity designs, you tend to focus only on people who are on the margins of receiving a custody sentence. And some of these sentencing grids are really only applicable to certain jurisdictions like the United States, and they're not applicable at least to Canada, which is why we needed an alternative solution. All right, so I'd like to sort of begin part 2 by setting the stage for what our sample was like. We have a pretty unique incarceration context in Canada compared to the United States, which is where we sort of get most of our research from. But also, I'm from the province of British Columbia. It's a population of, I think, maybe 8 million now, something like that. But we are quite a little bit different from a lot of other Canadian provinces as well. So I'm not suggesting that prison is necessarily a good place, but for some people, prison might be a better place. In the province of BC, for youth and adult custody facilities, they're not privatized. All people receive physical and mental health services and mental health screening. Each facility has a mental health professional or professionals who will coordinate services for the young person. People who are incarcerated have access to high school education, including they're part of the British Columbia public school system. They have daily programming opportunities for drug and alcohol counseling, mental health support, life skills, employment readiness. A survey of just under 5,000 people who are incarcerated in BC indicate that 81% were satisfied with service delivery. This isn't to say that Canada is perfect. And when we compare Canada's level of service opportunities to countries like Norway, certainly Canada falls short. And there's concerns in Canada specifically about the ability of prisons to provide services to women especially, but also our Indigenous population. And in British Columbia, we have within our general population about 5 to 7% of the population is Indigenous, but in custody it's closer to about 30%. So the purpose or the intended idea behind youth incarceration in Canada is rehabilitation. Our Youth Criminal Justice Act explicitly says that youth incarceration is meant to be a last resort. And when it is used, it should be used for the purpose of rehabilitation and not for punishment. So the Youth Criminal Justice Act, or the YCJA, kind of explicitly shot down the ideas of using custody as a deterrent to prevent future offending. So just to sort of compare how the youth incarceration rate in BC looks compared to some other jurisdictions. So one of the things that I've noted is that in Canada, we do not have mass incarceration the way that the United States does. We certainly have specific groups who are overrepresented in custody, but using Garland's definition of mass incarceration as going above the norm for a society of this type, certainly when we look at the United States, we could see evidence of mass incarceration. It's hard to get accurate data from the United States because the youth justice systems vary state by state, but it can be anywhere from about 200 to 350 youth per 10,000 in the population. On the right, you see the youth incarceration rate in Canada and British Columbia across different years. So as Ben mentioned, the ISBYOS began in 1998. So that's where we start. And then recruitment for the study ended in 2011. And we could see sort of some steady declines in the youth incarceration rate over that period of time. Just for reference, the most recent year of data in Canada and BC is 2022, 2023. And at that period of time for Canada, I think it was 2 per 10,000. And in BC, it was less than 1 per 10,000 youth. In Australia, and again, this I'm very happy to be corrected, but from the data that I could gather, it was about 16.3 per 10,000 across Australia as a whole. Also, what I'll do is I'll send to Ben after this my slides, and then I'm happy to have them disseminated to everybody. There's a hyperlink in the slide to take you to the site where I pulled the data from. There's also at the bottom there data on year over year average daily detention rates, which make it sort of not exactly comparable to Canada because we don't have information on sort of the daily average daily rates. But certainly we would suggest that in Canada, the youth incarceration rate looks much more similar to Australia than it does to the United States. I think the other more depressing similarity between Canada and Australia is the mass overrepresentation of Indigenous or First Nations people in our youth and our adult custody systems. So to get the data from the study, as we mentioned, it began in 1998 under the stewardship of Ray Corrado. At the time, there were about 10 different youth custody centers in the province of British Columbia. We now have basically 1.5, one in Burnaby, which is in the Metro Vancouver area, and one in Prince George, which is sort of more of a northern, a little bit more remote area. But that Prince George facility now is only open to boys. Again, we didn't have information on daily rates, but the last time I was in the youth custody center in Burnaby, which can hold about 130 kids, there were 8 kids there. So we recruited 1,719 youth to be participants in this study, and we followed them over time. And now most participants are in their 30s. So this is a study of youth who are incarcerated, but we followed them into adulthood, basically to try and understand what was going on with their adult social health and offending experiences. And we would begin sort of the recruitment process by doing an intake interview. And I just want to kind of provide a description of what is actually kind of a relatively average young person in our study. And the reason why I want to do this is to basically illustrate that this is not a typical sample of justice-involved youth on probation or anything like that, because Canada tends to reserve youth incarceration for kids involved in the most serious and violent offenses. We tend to have a relatively high risk sample, and so we have to be sort of cautious in generalizing this to other maybe not so high risk samples. Especially under the YCJ, judges were actually required to consider all other possibilities to a custody sentence, and in fact were prohibited from sentencing young people to custody if they didn't meet some pretty strict offense criteria. So John in adolescence. So I was a graduate student working on this project. I interviewed John to kind of like characterize him for you. He did not know his father. He did not want to have a relationship with his mother nor his brother. His mother had issues with alcohol use, and John reported that his mother's partners abused John, John's mother, and John's brother. We have at the Burnaby Youth Custody Center an inpatient assessment unit as well. And while John was at the inpatient assessment unit, he was diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We did interviews to capture a wide range of different perspectives of the self. And John described himself as unattractive and poor. And we used the Millen Adolescent Clinical Inventory as well as the MASI. And what stood out from John's sort of psychopathology profile was a tendency to be angry and irritable. John had a long use of substance use that began before age 12 with alcohol and ecstasy. And in terms of his antisocial and criminal behavior, he had 30 different foster care placements where throughout many of those placements, he was exposed to crime-involved youth. And subsequently, while John was at school, he would bully students, he disrupted his classroom, he was threatening teachers, and he dropped out of school by age 13. So between ages 12 to 17, John incurred 26 unique convictions and spent more than 1,000 days in custody. So my role on the project as a grad student was to conduct a lot of these interviews. But what I was really interested in was what was going to happen to these young people when they grew up. I wanted to know, do they all return to the adult custody system? What happens? Is the youth justice system working? Are there any positive or good stories? What are the sort of past desistance for this really high risk sample? And one of the reasons I was interested in this was after reading a book by Lobb and Sampson in 2003 called Shared Beginnings, Divergent Lives, where they followed a sample of relatively lower risk youth who had experienced reformatory school placement in around the 1940s, 1950s in Boston, Massachusetts area. And Lobb and Sampson came up with this term called desistance by default. They basically suggested that all people would eventually stop offending, including higher risk people, because informal social control or social bonds was a normative part of the adult life course. So people eventually, according to Lobb and Sampson, would get jobs, get married, they'd sort of be funneled into these social roles by macro level social structures, and that would influence desistance by default. And while I was not questioning Lobb and Sampson's findings, I was questioning whether their findings would apply to a higher risk sample. And so that's why we wrote this book, The Life Course of Serious and Violent Youth Grown Up, where we used a correctional software program to gather data on the life course outcomes of ISBYOS participants. I'm going to be very blunt. Don't buy this book as a hard copy or a paper copy. One of the things that I've learned now is to negotiate book price. And the cost of this book is embarrassingly high, and I'm pretty sure you can get it very cheap as an electronic copy. But yeah, I almost feel guilty promoting the book because of the price. So definitely, if you are interested in it, look for a cheap electronic copy. So here's sort of what we found about people like John in adulthood. In terms of his social environment, we have what's called a community risk needs assessment that's completed about every 6 months for members of our sample. And in adulthood, the CRNA for John indicated that he was having major barriers or major issues with his family and intimate partner relationships, an unstable living situation, behavioral and emotional instability, that all were sort of impacting his ability to desist from offending. In terms of mental health, John was diagnosed with drug-induced psychosis, and a pre-sentence report produced for the court indicated that a psychologist had diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. In terms of his substance use, he had near daily use of crystal methamphetamine, which was believed to have influenced the drug-induced psychosis. In terms of his antisocial and criminal behavior, over about an 11-year period, he incurred 9 new convictions, which does seem like a decline in offending. And there's a typo there, but I think it's he spent about 13,500 days in custody. So he spent a substantial amount of time in custody between ages 18 to 28. I think it was only like a third of that period of time that he was actually free in the community. And he's currently, or at the time of this writing, he was in custody because he stabbed a man who he didn't like because he saw him smiling on a bench, and that was enough to sort of feel angry about that situation. So I want to talk about where the impetus for this study also came from. I'm not actually like a correctional scholar. I don't label myself like that. I don't consider myself to be an expert on incarceration policies or custody programming or anything like that. For that book, what we were interested in looking at was whether changes in informal social control help produce or promote changes in convictions during the follow-up period. And it was important, like as I noted with John, spending a lot of time in custody that would limit opportunities to offend. So we thought that we should control for this. And so I just wanted to get to know the data better. So I was looking at changes in incarceration and whether that related to changes in convictions. And I basically, it was just something that sort of caught my eye, was that as John experienced a change in number of days incarcerated from ages 14 to 15, he experienced a reduction in number of convictions between ages 15 to 16, and that effect was relatively stable. So we were seeing this for our sample in general. Changes in custody were associated with changes in convictions, but in a negative way, which was sort of at the time that I was sort of writing this book, was not in line with sort of what I had understood about the relationship between incarceration and offending. So that sort of gave way to the actual paper. And in Canada, but especially in British Columbia, there's been a ton of discussion about what to do about perceived, not necessarily real, but perceived increases in serious and violent offending in our communities, and whether incarceration actually reduces reoffending. These discussions, though, they very often were just like policy briefs, news articles, media interviews, journalistic pieces, but across all sources, regardless of whether people were arguing that custody increased offending, decreased offending, empirical data or analysis was almost entirely always absent. So that was sort of also motivated the writing of the current paper. And what we found in this paper was that within individual increases in the amount of time spent in custody year over year were associated with year over year decreases in the number of convictions during the next measurement period. So we had data on participants from ages 12 to 40. Our main analyses focused on ages 12 to 25 because that's what included the bulk of our sample, but we wanted to sort of be robust. So we didn't just look at general convictions. We looked at violent convictions and also non-technical convictions. So we removed basically violations of court orders, so like breaches of probation or parole and things like that. And basically what we found was that across different types of convictions, across different measurement intervals, and across different age stages, we saw reductions in reoffending. So it didn't matter whether we were looking at ages 12 to 17, ages 18 to 25, ages 35 to 40. Didn't matter if we were looking at people who self-identified as male or people who self-identified as female. What we observed was that incarceration reduced reoffending. So before I'm just about finished here, and then we'll open it up for more of a discussion. What I kind of want to hit home is just because we observe that incarceration reduced reoffending does not mean that we should stop looking for alternatives to incarceration. In fact, I think that if we were to expand the use of incarceration, so if we were to take this type of finding and say that if we would just incarcerate more youth, we would see reductions in the crime rate. I think that we would eventually see what we tend to see in the United States research, which is that incarceration tends to have a null or a criminogenic effect. What we're seeing is a Canadian context where, after having restricted the use of incarceration, after having changed policies to make incarceration about rehabilitation rather than punishment or deterrence, maybe that has to do with why we are seeing reductions in reoffending. But I also don't want to give the impression that incarceration, therefore, is really positive or a good experience. When we think about John, we can see all the different ways that he was coming from extremely difficult circumstances. And so the custody environment in British Columbia might simply be an improvement from more severe forms of marginalization experienced in the community, and just a reminder that better does not mean good. For this sample, incarceration might just be a slightly better environment than their life in the community, and that might be why we were seeing year-over-year reductions in reconvictions during the follow-up period. And really, a lot of attention should be going to trying to prevent young people from being involved in the criminal justice system in the first place, especially because for Black and Indigenous persons in custody in Canada, there tends to be a disproportionate use of force. And we see issues not necessarily in British Columbia, but in Canada more generally, especially our prairie provinces, inadequate infrastructure, a lack of staff. I believe there's also like ongoing litigation against the province of Ontario for excessively long lockdowns due to insufficient staff. And so this is, again, just sort of a reminder that what we found in the BC context might not generalize to other places. There's also things that we missed or what we failed to do with our project, and these are some of the next steps that we want to address. Prison is often referred to as a black box in research. Throughout, it's not just our research, but it's a lot of research in the studies reviewed by Patrick et al. Tendency to just look at incarceration and reoffending, but say nothing about what actually happens in custody. And so some things that we need to understand include perceptions of incarceration. Was it specific deterrence that was actually influencing people to offend less while in the community? Did that increase in time in custody actually deter somebody from wanting to offend in the future? Or was it access to programming? So I certainly don't want to suggest using lengthier sentences for welfare purposes. In fact, the Canadian Youth Criminal Justice Act has banned using welfare needs as a justification for longer periods of time in custody or a longer sentence. But when you do spend more time in custody, if you're coming from extremely disadvantaged circumstances in the community, those longer periods of time in custody might provide additional access to programming needs. We could also begin to look at the informal networks that people experience while in custody, who they meet in custody. We've also often heard to custody centers as schools of crime. Could that perhaps have any influence on treatment effect heterogeneity? So what I mean by that is maybe the network of pro-social versus anti-social connections while in custody could dictate whether prison is reducing reoffending or actually criminogenic. Lastly, one of the things that we would like to also get to know is whether it was in fact not prison, but more intensive monitoring following release from prison, and the acknowledgement that people who feel that they're being supervised and monitored more closely might be deterred from reoffending during the follow-up period. We weren't able to, in this study, account for differences in supervision criteria. So I think I went a little bit long. Apologies for that, but thanks for bearing with me. And I'll shut my slides down so that I can see you all. But if anybody wants me to open them back up for any questions, I'm happy to do so. Thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Evan. That was a really informative and interesting talk and very timely. We do actually have at least one question, and I'd encourage other people to enter their questions into either chat or into the Q&A box. Our first question comes from Abigail Lewis. How do you differentiate between reoffending and reconviction in the study, or is reconviction taken as the sole measure of reoffending?
Sorry, I missed. My apologies. I was reading the first comment and I missed that one already.
Okay,
Do you
so
mind repeating?
How do you differentiate between reoffending and reconviction in the study, or is reconviction the sole measure of reoffending?
Yeah, that's correct, Abigail. We only have reconviction data. We don't have self-report offending or rearrest, for example.
Is just following up on that, is that a particular limitation in the, I don't know about the Canadian youth justice context, but in the kind of, at least the Victorian youth justice context, convictions might not really be a reliable indicator of reoffending, given that a lot of kind of cases might not kind of end in conviction.
Yeah, so what I would point to are papers done by David Kirk in around 2006, Janet Lortz in 1998, and there was a special issue, I believe, in Crime and Delinquency in 2014. So when it comes to trying, like, no measure of offending is going to be perfect. But when it comes to longitudinal data, David Kirk, for example, found extreme problems actually with self-report data in terms of their reliability, in terms of asking people if they've ever been arrested, for example, and a large number of people self-reporting they've never been arrested, despite official data indicating that they have. What we tend to see, and now we're not able to address this in our study, but I'm forgetting who specifically wrote the papers in 2014, but I know David Farrington was a co-author of one of them. We would see differences in level, but not necessarily differences in pattern. So we would tend to see that self-reports are always going to be higher than official convictions, for example. But what we don't tend to see is a flip in rank order. So if we were to take 1,000 people and rank them in terms of number of convictions and number of self-report offenses, their rank order doesn't change too much, regardless of whether we rely on self-report or official data. So definitely, like, we are missing a ton of actual number of offenses, but also when you look at another big one would be, as we've seen a tendency to move towards restorative justice and diversion from the youth court system, we'd see an even more dramatic reduction in official data or official convictions. But we were able to account for differences in youth justice system exposure, and we didn't find differences in our study findings depending on whether people came of age in eras where restorative justice and diversion was used more common.
Okay. I'm just going to try and get through the other questions. So our next question comes from Ashley Battistini. Okay, so your slides, it's in relation to, okay, so I know you said your slides will have references to stats, but I'm curious if you can say again where the youth incarceration rate for the US you reported came from. Unless I'm misunderstanding the data from that slide, the number seems extraordinarily high, even considering mass incarceration in the USA. A 2025 report from the Prison Policy Initiative in the US estimated 26 youth under the age of 18 in detention per 100,000, which is still nearly 2 times the global average, but not hundreds of youth per 10,000. I think it's meant to be 100,000.
I would have to have a closer look at that, but also I think what Ashley is missing is that you're looking at kids in juvenile confinement facilities, but the United States regularly incarcerates youth with adults. And so what you're missing are youth in adult custody facilities. So I'll pull up my paper while we're chatting to actually pull up the reference, but that could be one of the reasons why the data that you have are different from the data that we have.
Our next question comes from Mike Birchall. Thanks, Evan. Do you have any thoughts on whether incarceration accelerated neurological or psychological maturation and the role this might play in reducing reoffending?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Part of we don't have repeat measures of psychological maturation, but there's a paper using data, I believe, from the Pathways to Desistance study called Arrested Development. And I believe from that paper, they found that incarceration actually had a reduction, like it was detrimental to psychological maturation. But I can't actually say that in this, whether we would have observed that in our study, because we don't have the data to look at changes in psychosocial maturation over time.
Okay. I had maybe one last follow-up question, which is around the kind of identification and kind of model that was kind of used, the first difference estimator. One of the criticisms that's come up around kind of fixed effects models and causal inference is around kind of the choice of kind of differencing. I don't know if you examined kind of the possibility and linearity of the effects. I don't know whether you kind of check different model specifications to see how robust that effect would be, like under second differencing, third differencing.
Yeah, exactly. So we also examined second differencing as well. And then we also to look at different linear effects, we also changed it from the age period going from year over year to developmental changes. So we created 4 developmental groups, and these were a little bit arbitrary, but 12 to 17, 18 to 25, 26 to 29, and 30 to 35. And looked at those as the different measurement periods as opposed to year over year. And we found the same thing regardless of whether we looked at year over year or developmental stage. So yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish.
No. So basically, we observed the same relationship, but once we got to like 3 years from the effect or 4 years from the effect, we no longer saw this a significant decline. So, for example, changes in days incarcerated from 15 to 16 did not impact changes in number of convictions between, like, I don't know, 18 to 19 or 19 to 20, which I also think kind of would make sense. We wouldn't really expect there to be those long-term impacts on change. We'd maybe expect long-term impacts in terms of the overall number, but that's about it.
Very last one, since I don't see another question. Just in relation to the model, can we kind of confidently assume that there were no other kind of all other time varying confounders were kind of dealt with?
So regardless of the fixed effect model, whether you're using first differencing or person mean centering, it will address all time invariant factors, but certainly there are going to be time variant factors that will matter. We accounted for aging, but then the next step, for example, would be to look at what changed during the custody process that might have accounted for the decline in the number of convictions. So
in other words, there could be another kind. This could be kind of this relationship observed could be due entirely to another kind of time varying confounder that's just we don't know about yet.
Yeah,
so
so
it's open to speculation.
Yeah, and I fully believe that there is. Because I don't think that there. I think the question is what is going on during that custody period. It's not that custody is its own unique thing. It's what is happening while people are in custody. Was it changes in treatment that led to changes in substance use? Was it changes in perceptions of fairness in the criminal legal system? We don't really know what's going on. So we know that while people spent more time in custody, they experienced reductions in reoffending, but we don't know whether that effect was a deterrent effect, changes in perceptions of justice, changes in psychosocial maturation, all things that sort of would be a next step there.
Okay, excellent. I think that's it in terms of time. We're 1 minute over. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That
thanks
was
for
an
having me.
excellent and really informative presentation, as I said a number of times now, really timely, and lots to think about. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late over there. Well, it's past kind of normal working hours, so
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Still
particularly
before dinner, so
grateful.
that's nice.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you for our next seminar, which you'll hear about on our
Thanks for coming, everyone.
list.